Welcome to the video version of Sprout Lab's webinar on designing 70-20-10 learning campaigns. We don't actually record the live session, partly because the experiences are fairly interactive and we find that people actually interact less if they're being recorded. This gives me a chance to be able to summarize a few different things, and also some of the slides in this particular recording is different to what actually happened in the webinar as well. Short introduction to me. I'm Robin Pettard. I'm the founder of Sprout Labs. I'm also the principal consultant at Learned. Sprout Labs essentially works with digital learning platforms that help you author and deliver high-impact digital learning systems. The two systems we most often work with is Glasshouse, our own smart learning system is currently how we're talking about it, and Tatara, which is an open learning management system. I'm also a principal at Learned. At Learned, we do more sort of consulting work, especially around designing learning ecosystems. Now, if this is the first time you come to a bit of content from Sprout Labs, there's a few other things we do, like the Learning Like Working podcast, essentially about once a fortnight, maybe once a week. A blog post goes out. We have a series of ebooks. There's a whole collection now, a recording of past webinars as well, and we are also thinking about running a virtual conference in the near future. In this particular recording, this is what we're going to discuss. In actual fact, I sent out some email messages to some of the people who signed up to the webinar before the session. Actually found out a lot of people were really after quite an introduction to the 70-20-10 learning model. So I've actually spent more time talking about the 70-20-10 learning model than what I expected. I'm going to dive into the process for designing learning campaigns. This still probably hasn't been as detailed as what I would really like. I talk a little bit about the difference between push and pull learning campaigns as well, and then really deeply embedded into what I'm talking about and the approaches I'm talking about is digital learning technologies. Now, just a quick summary of what the 70-20-10 learning model is. Essentially, it's this idea that 70% of what we learn happens through experience, through learning on the job. It's also the thing that draws us in. It's quite often very easy to copy what people are doing around us. 20% happens from our peers, and especially from our line managers. Then 10% happens from formal courses and more formal learning experiences. Now, what's really interesting about the 70-20-10 learning model is quite often I introduce it to groups of people by actually asking what's been their best learning experience, and then pulling it together to find out that in actual fact what then happens in the room when I'm running a workshop around learning by working, that people actually come up almost with the same sort of balance. In a conversation with Charles Jennings, he actually said that the research showed quite different figures, and these were sort of summaries. And it's not actually a formula; it's a recipe. It's something to sit there and go. In actual fact, learning is a mixture of different things. Now, this is very different to what the L&D in workplaces has been in the recent past. That difference means it's not always easy to make that transformation to a continuous learning environment that the 70-20-10 model means. It means different types of learning models, which we're going to talk a little bit about, different approaches to learning technologies, and different types of thinking about bringing together all of these approaches, which is really around design thinking. We're not going to do a deep dive into design thinking, but we'll look at a couple of steps and stages and how they're different for designing learning campaigns a little bit later in the recording. The 70-20-10 learning model means changes for everyone that's involved in learning. For L&D people, it means becoming a learning ecosystem designer. For learners, it means becoming a whole lot more self-directed. And for managers, it means becoming a learning leader as a primary part of what their role is. When I sent the messages around about what people wanted from the webinar, one person sat there and asked, I would be really interested to know what goes wrong with 70-20-10 learning models. And really, I think it's about those three roles and really not actually helping people become, say, learning leaders as managers and not helping employees become self-guided. So a few other things that not really designing and supporting the 70, just thinking it's going to happen and not giving the people with it the time and opportunity and skills to become self-guided learners and learning managers. The other one I see repeatedly is people start to focus on professional development plans first. Because that's sort of almost would be the ultimate if people were involved in a spot where they are continuously learning, continuously improving. Now, what's really hard about this is quite often I've seen in organizations where people have moved to a 70-20-10 learning model with their professional learning plans, but then L&D has kept on essentially just running out the same old courses, which is not meant which has meant that people haven't seen a cultural change and cultural shift. And they still feel like, well, L&D's still running courses. Why are they telling us to make this shift to workplace learning when they haven't made the shift? Now, what do I mean by designing the 70? In actual fact, a lot of people sit there and say, actually, this is one of those things a little bit like teaching creativity. You can't actually directly do it. Well, you can. What you can do is you might not have direct control over the 70, so you need to build the conditions around the workplace and managers' involvement and peer involvement to really foster what's actually happening in the 70. Now, at this particular moment, I opened the webinar up to the floor to get some interaction from people about what it means to be learning by working. And there were some great ideas about continuously growing, and actually one of the ones I really like was this idea of the manager having a grab bag of tasks to bolster learning, and training and being and working in a safer environment. There were some things here that were themes, things like, and I think it's actually it said the word used multiple times about stretching you and challenging you, and then reflecting. Now, I see the 70-20-10 as a model. It's about how people learn. It's not a framework. The people actually need more than just that particular statement to be able to really build continuous learning experiences. Now, you might have actually heard me use the term a couple of times already of learning by working. So we've actually put together a learning by working framework. And you can download it from our website if you haven't done that already. I'm just going to quickly talk about three design patterns, three common types of activities that actually happen in L&D and how the 70-20-10 model can work in each one of those three. I find it really useful now having this sort of pattern of types of learning activities that L&D do. When we're challenged with a problem, I sit there and go, oh, is this about bringing new knowledge into the organization? Is it about sharing knowledge, or is it about innovation? And it's actually probably that one that's innovation is actually really new for an organization. So in actual fact, it's not easy to bring new knowledge into an organization. And this is a classic thing of you need skills in such and such project management. Go out to an external group of people who run a series of courses about project management, and then it becomes a challenge to actually transfer that into the 20 and 70. And I think this is actually where we need to remember that change is not easy, and actually making change happen is not easy as well. And I think that this is a spot where it's really quite nice to have this frame around learning campaigns of working in a way to bring new knowledge in. Now, what's really interesting is things like sharing knowledge, onboarding. It can actually start in the 70s. It's possibly one reason why people sit there and say, yeah, I learned from people around me. Because essentially, literally, when you're sharing knowledge, you're copying people. You're doing what's the things that people are next to you. And this is also a bit of my chance to sit there and say, this is actually one of the problems with 70 and experiential learning, because sometimes you might actually be doing the wrong thing. So sharing knowledge can be something that can be based in the 70s, and sometimes it's guided through more formal learning. And likewise, continuous learning cultures where new ideas and new knowledge is being created starts through the 70. So this is sort of that sense of things like lessons learned sessions and peer sharing to be able to build a continuous spot and continuous places for learning to happen. Now, the bringing together of all of this is I think of it as that ecosystem. And it's a really nice way of thinking about it, because essentially the 70-20-10 model sits there and says, well, there's multiple parts. So how do we bring these multiple parts to get together? And I personally find this ecosystem approach as being the perfect way to do this. To paraphrase J. Cross, I think it is a natural way to learn. Now, the framework we put together and we sort of embed into the way we work is this one. And sometimes we don't always have all the parts, but most normally and generally we do have some elements in those. Essentially, people need pathways. They need guides to learning while working. They need to know where they're going. And then they need people around them to help support them in that journey. And ways of being able to access and think about and reflect in the flow of working. Quite often one of the challenges that actually happens is that the only way to access an organization's actual knowledge is through training. So one of the foundations of moving to a spot where you can actually work in a more continuous learning environment and less formal learning is to actually make sure you have the right learning supports and performance supports in place to start with. The other thing is then what actually happens is if the knowledge components of your organization are removed from training, that means your training can be almost like a hothouse. It can be an opportunity for people to be able to practice skills, explore things, and work with others rather than being information dumps. Now, people quite often ask and want to know about the learning theories behind the 70-20-10 learning model. Cobb's experiential learning theories have been around for a long time, and I think it's actually partly about, and some of the ideas around this helps us start to put some of the bones around the learning while working framework and actually how you work with the 70-20-10 model to make it happen. Essentially, someone has a concrete experience, and then they move into a spot where they might observe and start to reflect, and then formalize abstract concepts and then test those new concepts. So what I really like about this is it's actually not just sitting there saying people have an experience and then they change, because there's many things we all do and many habits we all have that we keep on doing the same thing over and over again, and we don't actually learn from experience. It's actually this cycle, and then what actually happens is with experiential learning in the 70-20-10 model is it's about helping people move through this cycle. Now, one of the reasons to talk about the podcast earlier, because I'm going to make references to a couple of podcasts during this particular session, and this is an upcoming one with Paul Kearney. Paul quite often works with people pre-employment rather than learning while working. He's got this really nice framework which is about increasing experience, and then getting people to articulate what they've learned and then really reflecting on what they've learned, and has a series of quite simple tools to help with this. Core of what we're talking about today is the idea of learning campaigns in a 70-20-10 learning model. Essentially, a learning campaign is a series of experiences that happen over a period of time. Different mediums are used to engage people in different ways. And because it's a learning program, it's really designed around behavioural change. Most often when you see a learning campaign approach, it's focused on learning transfer. And there might be a bit of content, like a quiz at the beginning or a video, and then over a period of time, essentially things are fed out to people. So what's actually happening is the learning experience becomes a lot more a spaced learning experience, and there's repetition linking back into this as well. Now, I think this is great, and we do lots of work, and it's a core part of what our platform Glasshouse does. But there's also this sense that 70-20-10 means working beyond courses. And learning campaigns is also a useful approach to working beyond courses. So rather than just being about 10 and about content, it can then be about sort of triggering and pushing out messages and helping people do things like work shadowing, and then triggering the manager to make sure that they've debriefed that and what sort of questions they should be asking someone after a shadowing experiences. And then triggering for the learner to write that up in a learning log. So in actual fact, what can then happen, and to be honest, what can then probably be really powerful is if the 70-20-10 and all of those are mixed together. Now, to dive a bit more into learning campaigns for a little while, learning should be around changing behaviour, and marketing is also about changing a behavior. It's actually about influencing someone to actually buy a product or a new service. Now, there's many things L&D can learn from marketing. I did this great podcast last year with Mike Taylor. Mike Taylor actually works as an L&D person, essentially in a marketing and sales company. So he has a really different and really strong view on this. So Mike in the podcast talks about the campaign-based approach and the repetition that I've just talked about. But he also talks about the way marketing focuses on emotions and storytelling as really powerful things we can learn, and then short messaging and making sure things are really visual. Building emotive learning experiences in workplace is sometimes a challenge. You have to really think about what the value proposition for the learner is. What's their context? What have they got to gain? What's their pains? If you are interested in thinking about really making things more emotive, explore as you're doing the analysis stage of building your learning experiences about why at an emotional level things are happening in certain ways. Ask questions like, well, how would someone feel about this? Well, if this result happened, what would the team feel? How would they feel differently about it? One particular nice frame of mind around learning and marketing is this stages of change model, where essentially it thinks about what the relationship between marketing and sales. The marketing is really about helping people become who more aware of their problems and then start to contemplate making a buying decision, then preparing for action or preparing for behavioral change. This is where the sales process comes back through. Now this isn't actually a model from sales and marketing. It's actually a model from psychology. But it's really interesting to think about it in terms of this marketing and sales process. And then when someone actually buys something, they become a customer. Now, what's really interesting for this is I actually think about this in terms of terms of a journey. And in a course, quite often we do try to do the same things. We try to think about, well, where's someone's knowledge about this? What's their motivations? Then you try to prepare them for action by giving them opportunities to feedback. But then there's also no ability to be able to practice beyond the actual course experience, or no way after the course to really give them feedback after it. So it's very interesting because essentially I think we try to work with this stages to change model in learning, but we always seem to try to jam it into a course. So this is what's nice about the learning campaign idea. It gives you a chance to be able to split it up into multiple parts, to be able to then work with things in a really different way. One of the biggest trends in marketing at the moment that L&D can learn a lot from is marketing automation. In marketing, this is quite often a situation where a trigger might often create and cause a series of emails that might be in a sequence. And this might be just based on them visiting a page. So a good example of this is as someone downloads a ebook from Sprout Labs webinar, from Sprout Labs website, a couple of days later, a message comes out about our next webinar. Then someone signs up to the webinar, they then get another message suggesting that they possibly can actually bring along the rest of their team to get more results from that as well. So in another podcast with Ronnie Flerman from Game Effectiveness, she talks about this as the idea of learning automation. There might be a trigger in the workplace, someone's performance might go down on a certain metric, and then they might be sent a piece of learning that's actually a solution to help them actually fix that particular KPI. And there's still the exciting notion of matching micro-learning experiences with actual trigger events in learning really opens up really different types of possibilities. At this particular moment, I opened again to the group to come up with some ideas about tools and strategies marketing use that might be more useful for learning. Now, in actual fact, some of the really nice things that came up were things like visual messaging and infographics and using video and looking at data in a different way because marketing's become so data-driven. Some really nice ideas around different types of use of videos, around videos from peers, from managers, and celebrity endorsements. And that whole sort of pressuring thing that sometimes happens in marketing around time. Now, marketing's not always easy. So, in actual fact, in some ways in L&D, we've got it easy. So, in actual fact, the marketing process is about pulling people into a situation, and the buyer is totally in control. So what they actually have to then do is push out messages to try to actually get people to engage. Now, in actual fact, in most realities, in most situations, what happens in L&D is it's the organisation pushing out learning to actually be telling people what they need to be doing. Just a little bit of an interesting thought experiment would be what would happen if L&D was pulling people in to a learning cycle. So essentially there was a campaign constantly happening around discretionary learning, what people don't always find the time to do, that people can pull in to the moment where they move from being unaware of their need to being aware, and then they can move through those stages of those 5 stages that I talked about a few moments ago. Now, we moved on to talking about the process for designing learning campaigns. Sprout Labs uses design thinking for working through process design. I'm not going to do a really deep dive into what design thinking is and how it's different to other approaches like ADDIE. Essentially, this approach is sort of understanding and exploring, prototyping. It's a balance of really working in a really empathetic way with your learners and really understanding your context, and really then also working in a more creative way to explore different approaches and testing it. Now, during this sort of understanding phase, I think about design thinking as being about 3 things: the learners, the business problem, and context. Design thinking traditionally is about the end user only. I think for L&D it shifts a little bit. And then in the situation where we're thinking about learning campaigns, there's a few things that become a little bit different about the sort of questions and things that need to be explored during this understanding and analysis phase. It's actually what channels. I'm using the word channels because this is a very marketing term rather than mediums or platforms or other things that might be more relevant to the normal blended learning language. And then also thinking about what channels might be out there to support people that you're currently not using. I also couldn't help but slot in a little bit about data. It's one of the constant themes that Sprout Labs is about thinking about learning in terms of what data you have and what data might be impacted and how data can be used to drive learning experiences as well. Another great interactive exercise happened at this particular moment around what channels exist in organisations that L&D are not using. So lots of things around physical spaces, things like screens and breakup rooms or elevators or TVs that are possibly sometimes used in foyers for announcements. And one of the things that got a few people excited was actually sitting there doing a whole, back at toilet doors. That's actually a classic advertising spot, which people are not using in L&D, or maybe even sometimes not even using it in organizations. Now, before I mapped out that notion that a learning campaign can actually then be a really different type of experience, if it's a 70-20-10 learning model. So when it comes to that sort of stage of exploring possible solutions, you have a different palette of different types of learning activities if you're focusing on a 70 and 20 model. This particular fairly simple framework has been put together by one of our instructional designers, Graham Kirkwood. We use it when we're doing this sort of process of building learning guides for managers and learners in the 70 and 20. Quite often, these are things about actually supporting a model that's originally in the 70. But what I quite like about it is the way it's been sorted into the notion that when someone's starting, they're at a spot where they're doing quite observational things, like work shadowing, watching someone, and then the managers at the spot, they might be just asking, well, what did you learn from that? What did you absorb? The next step is more instructional. There might be watching a peer go through a process and actually getting the peer explaining what they're doing. And then as someone's developing more expertise, it might be actually rather than a peer talking them through that process, is actually doing this exactly the same task that someone's doing and mirroring that process. And then the manager doing the debrief. And as people are developing more expertise and probably spend quite a bit more time in this sort of standard work activity situation, they then move into the spot where they might be able to do more investigative things, looking for problems, and looking for problems in their own work and other people's work. Then as they become more experts, they can actually start to develop job aids and tools that other learners can actually work with. And this creates really deep, rich learning experiences because people are in a spot where they're having to really articulate what they've learned. So it's essentially at that particular spot, and that's almost where I slot projects into, but it might also be around investigative strategies as well. So particularly these types of 70-20-10 learning journeys need to be scaffolded and they need to be supported some way. The learners need those workplace tasks going out to them, questions that they can ask their peers, things for multiple choice questions for doing self-assessments, and really questions to be able to put into their learning log as well. Managers need to know when they're completed certain tasks in that process, and then what questions they could be using to do this. This is particularly how I think about learning campaigns and digital technology, is that in actual fact, you can set up learning journeys that are actually about sending out notifications, maybe mobile notifications or email messages to people to be able to support these types of activities. So it's this sort of sense of a journey that's triggered by notifications, emails, or mobiles. This is actually something that our content platform, Glasshouse, does as well. Now, there is actually different ways of being able to do these types of notifications and journeys. Quite often people will pick up a tool that's actually from marketing, like email marketing tools like MailChimp, compared to sort of spaced learning and micro-learning platforms like Glasshouse. So a few things to be aware of about the pros and cons of each. MailChimp is really for text and images, whereas the other sorts of space learning platforms, you can have text and images and then links to particular interactive content. As you would expect, most of the marketing platforms have really great analytics, but those analytics don't integrate back into our learning standards like 70-20, like XAPI. The marketing platforms are quite often, especially something like MailChimp, is really designed for small businesses, and it doesn't sort of have many enterprise features. Multiples of these types of space learning platforms can be triggered by learning interactions. So game effectiveness, talked about in this podcast that's coming out this particular week, they're triggering these types of messages from actual performance on the job or from quizzes. In Glasshouse, we can do it based on learning experiences. So if someone does has a particular activity or makes a particular choice in an activity, it can then trigger a set of follow-up messages as well. MailChimp and most of the email platforms, because email is actually been proven to be the most effective thing in terms of marketing, is actually very email focused. Some of these other sort of micro learning and space learning platforms are more of an ecosystem around things like email as well as mobile apps as well. Now, we did a couple of great interactive exercises to wrap up. One we had a little bit more time for, and one we had less time for. So this first one was one we had more time for. So it was essentially designing a 70-20-10 campaign that's helping people become more self-guided at onboarding. Now, onboarding actually has a set of real challenges to it because people don't have a deep set of expertise yet about what the organization does. Some great ideas in this particular slide, including these things like removing content because it's not behavioural and cultural based, really focusing on what needs to happen in terms of culture and in an organisation rather than being an information dump. Really like this notion of accessing SMEs and starting to build networks. It's a very 70 and 20 approach, so that rather than people spending time in a classroom or an online situation during their induction, they're actually going out and reaching out to people to be able to have conversations with them. The scavenger hunt's a really nice one in terms of going through a corporate internet or a place to be able to find things. Likewise, the guided tour. Some really nice ideas there from everyone. We only quickly explored the other one, which was about a 70-20-10 approach to compliance training. Now, one of the things that did also come up in this conversation that was really hard to capture in chat quickly was the notion that if you're actually doing something that's compliance-based, it probably needs to be observed in the workplace. And then the challenges around that and the possibilities of that as well. And that can possibly be something that could be a really powerful thing for digital learning to be able to capture it in online checklists. I've talked about it a couple of times. Glasshouse is essentially Sprout Labs' platform. That's a HTML-based cloud authoring platform that you can also do delivery work for. It's not a replacement for your LMS. It works with your LMS. So it actually enables some of the sort of strategies we're talking about today around spaced learning and triggering different types of messages to different types of people and helping scaffold those and triggering those based on activity and learning activities as well. And the messages can also be sent to managers and coaches. They'll probably be in some of the material, and if you're watching the video, you probably can't, but if you go to getglasshouse.com, you can sign up to get early access to this. Just a quick note, every week I spend a few hours talking to people who've been to our webinars. I just really like to get feedback, talk to people, find out what people are thinking, especially after people have been to a couple of webinars. I quite often send a message reaching out to see if you want to have a chat as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for getting to the end of the video version of this webinar. I hope you really found it useful.